Good morning and welcome to yet another exciting edition of 7th grade social studies. Yep, it's that time, ladies and gentlemen. So let's get to work. Word of advice really fast for those of you out there and you know who you are. You even haven't watched the first video already. So go ahead and take a moment, pause this video, go back and watch the intro to the Renaissance. This is the kind of information that builds upon one another. So if you're missing the first piece, it's going to be kind of hard for you to make sense of what we'll be studying today. So just go back and take a look at that. Okay, now for the rest of you that have watched the first video, let's quickly recap and take a look at some of the things we learned from that first video. But before that, let's take a look at our goals for this lesson. We're going to quickly review the reasons behind the origins of the Renaissance. Going to take a look at the growth of city-states. And last but not least, understand the impact that the city-state of Florence had on the Renaissance. Okay, so taking a look at the three reasons behind the Renaissance, you want to look at trade and commerce. Now, in the 11th century, Europe had gone to war in the Middle East. There was a series of wars called the Crusades, which was instigated by the church in order to take back the Holy Land, known as Jerusalem. But that's really not important. What was the main point about that fact was that Europeans had begun to venture and journey into the East, and they began to learn about different cultures that had different architect, different clothing, different foods, and things of that nature. So it definitely sparked an interest into the East. Later, there was the famous Italian adventurer explorer Marco Polo. Some of you guys probably know him from the pool game. Marco Polo wrote a book about his travels to the east. He traveled as far east as China. He brought back tales of the wonderful silkworm, about he also talked about fireworks and all the things he had experienced in the east. Now this definitely led to interest in that area. And so traders and merchants began exploring and trying to figure out ways that they could bring back some of that material wealth back into the West. Now, this led to the growth of city-states. As we've been looking at feudalism, a lot of people were tied to the land. But as the Renaissance really began to take place and flourish, people began to move to urban areas. We're going to take a look at some of the cities like Venice and Genoa and Florence. This had a domino effect as people began to trade goods and services and they began to make their own things. This had a huge impact on these city-states. So instead of trading and bartering for goods, this developed into a money economy. People no longer would barter, let's say, a loaf of bread for a sack of potatoes. Or maybe if you needed your horse to get new hooves or shoes, you would go to the blacksmith and say, hey, my wife is an excellent sewer, maybe she can make you some clothes. So what this led to was now people were using money instead of bartering goods and services. Of course, this led to industries like banking. A lot of merchants turned into bankers, and they would lend people money so they could start their businesses. Also, it created a high demand for craftspeople. So now you had specialists like blacksmiths who would work with iron and steel, or maybe carpenters, or even artists, sewers, bread makers, all kinds of different professions. So let's take a look at some of the key city-states that arose during this time period. Over here you can see Venice, or Venus, excuse my improper enunciation. And over here to the west we've got Genoa, or Genoa. And right here in the middle we've got the city-state of Florence. Now you can take a look at the geography of the area. Italy has an excellent position that allowed them easy access and trade with the East. A lot of these cities became major centers of import and export, even though an inland city like Florence itself was right smack dab in the middle of Italy. it became a vital halfway point, so to speak, between the two cities of Genoa and Venice, and also into other areas of Europe. And we'll take a look at that on the next slide. Okay, over here you can take a look at the map. We've got all these different routes. We've got Genoa over here. We've got Venice over here. And right here in the middle would be where the city-state of Florence would be. So you can see how these cities were all major connections to the rest of Europe, and not just Europe, but also Africa. Genoa was a key part of the trade in northern Africa that dealt with ivory. Venice was a huge seaport city, and they controlled the seas as far as trading silk and spices. And then you see Florence right again in the middle of Italy here, played a vital role in trading into the rest of Europe. Okay, let's take a more in-depth look at Florence. Florence is considered by many to have been the cultural center of the Renaissance. Some have even termed it the cradle of the Renaissance. One thing of note is that Florence was the banking center of Europe. Now, this is very key and very vital. A lot of people would come to Florence to exchange their currency for florins. These were the gold coins of Florence. Now, the key point in that is that you could use Florentine money anywhere in Europe. Think of the euro today in the European Union. How if you go to Europe, using the euro is almost acceptable in just about any country in that sphere. Also, you can kind of compare Florence to our very own Charlotte, North Carolina. Down here you see a picture of Bank of America, one of the largest, if not the largest, banking center or bank in the United States. Also Wells Fargo, that used to be Wachovia. Many of you might have parents that work in some part of the banking industry. So this was key in Florence. Also centered in Florence was Mercato Nuovo. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but I gave it my best shot. This was also a huge place for trade. So people from all over Europe would come to this market specifically to trade and sell their goods. Also worthy of note is that Florence was a major center of the woolen cloth making. So they did a lot of making clothes and exporting that around the world. Some other advancements to note about Florence is that they had success in just about every area of life. Let's take a look at just a couple of those. In art, artists discovered different techniques. One of them was using perspective to give their art more depth. They also discovered that using shading would give their work more of a three-dimensional feel on a flat surface, which before this time was a very hard thing to do. Over here, if you take a look, we've got a picture by Sandro Botticelli, known as the Adoration of the Magi. See here, before this time, artists just didn't have as much expression or in-depth of their pictures. Here you can take a look at the vanishing point here in the back, and it really gives the picture a three-dimensional kind of look. Some other things that were advanced in Florence was the use of math and science. Okay, artists used math, geometry to divide the space in paintings to make it more realistic. Other famous artists like Da Vinci studied human anatomy to make paintings and sculptures more lifelike and realistic. If you look down here below, you can see Michelangelo's David. As you can see, this figure is very lifelike and realistic. You can even tell the expression on the young man's face. This is by far one of Michelangelo's most famous works. Add to that, in Florence, they advanced other ideas by studying ancient architecture of the Romans and the Greeks, and they used this to construct domes. Last but not least, other areas of advancement was literature. There was a famous poet of the time named Dante, What he did is that he began to write in the modern day vernacular. In other words, Dante would create works that could be understood in the people's everyday language. Before this time, a lot of the writing was in formal Latin, which only the educated or the upper class could read and understand. All right. And so there were very more advancements that the Florentines created and used to further the ideas of the Renaissance. But we'll take a look at that later on in the week. You guys are going to take a recreated tour of the city of Florence, so that'll be very exciting. And the next time we'll look at some of the very influential leaders of the Renaissance. So stay tuned.